I went to the cabin because I wanted quiet. That was the only reason. I had been tired for months. Tired in a deep way that sleep at home did not fix. The cabin was listed online as old but solid, far from towns, surrounded by trees, with no neighbors. That sounded perfect. I packed food, water, extra clothes, a first aid kit, and tools I thought I might need. I told myself I was being careful, but I also felt confident. I believed nothing bad would happen because nothing bad ever had. The drive took hours. The road slowly changed from clean pavement to cracked asphalt, then to gravel. My phone lost signal long before I reached the place. The forest grew thicker, darker, and more closed in. Trees leaned toward the road like they were trying to listen. When I finally saw the cabin, it looked smaller than the pictures. It sat in a clearing that felt too tight, like the trees had only stepped back a little. The wood walls were gray and rough. The roof sagged slightly in the middle. It did not look abandoned, but it did not look cared for either. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air smelled old, like dust and damp wood. The place had one main room, a small kitchen area, and a bedroom in the back. The windows were small and cloudy. Light came in weak and yellow. I dropped my bag and stood still for a moment, listening. The cabin made soft noises, wood popping and shifting, the normal sounds of a building settling. I told myself that was fine. I spent the first day unpacking, cleaning surfaces, and checking everything. The water pump worked after a few tries. The stove lit up. The door locks were solid. The windows were latched. Outside, I walked the area around the cabin. There were no fresh tracks that I could see, just leaves, dirt, and old animal paths. I noticed something strange, though. The grass near the cabin was pressed down in long, uneven lines, like something heavy had been dragged through it. I assumed it was from previous renters moving logs or equipment. I did not think much of it. That night, the forest felt louder than I expected. Wind moved through the trees in slow waves. Branches rubbed against each other. Somewhere far away, an animal cried out, then went quiet. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to relax. The dark felt thick, like it had weight. I reminded myself that this was normal, that being alone always made things feel bigger. The next morning, I woke up early. Sunlight barely reached the ground outside. A fog hung low between the trees. I made breakfast and sat by the window watching the fog move. That was when I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. One of the kitchen windows had a smear on the outside, right at the bottom edge. It looked like a handprint, but stretched, like someone had dragged their hand along the glass. I touched the inside of the window. The latch was still locked. I told myself it could be anything. Mud, an animal, old marks I missed before. Still, I cleaned the glass and kept glancing outside. The forest looked the same, but it felt different now, like it was watching me instead of the other way around. Later that day, I walked farther than I had the first time. I followed a narrow trail that curved behind the cabin. After about 10 minutes, I found something that stopped me cold. There was a pile of trash bags hidden behind thick bushes. They were torn open, old and new mixed together. Cans, food wrappers, broken plastic, and things that looked like they had been there for years. This was not normal dumping. It looked like someone had been living nearby and hiding it. I walked back fast, my heart beating hard. When the cabin came into view, I felt relief, but it did not last. The door was slightly open. I knew for a fact I had closed it. I stood still for a long time, listening. I heard nothing. No movement. No footsteps. Just the forest. I went inside slowly. Everything looked the same. My bag was where I left it. The food was untouched. The locks on the windows were still closed. I checked every corner. Nothing. No sign anyone had been there. Still, I locked the door and pushed a chair against it. My hands were shaking, and I hated that. As the day went on, small things kept happening. A cup I knew I placed on the counter was on the table instead. Dirt appeared on the floor near the back door. Scratches showed up on the outside wall, long and deep, too straight to be from animals. I kept trying to explain it all away, but my mind would not settle. That night was worse. I woke up to a sound that did not belong. It was slow and heavy, like something moving with effort, came from outside, near the bedroom wall. I held my breath and listened. The sound stopped. Then it started again, closer this time, right near the window. I could hear breathing. Not fast, not panicked. Calm breathing. I did not move. I did not make a sound. I lay there for what felt like hours. The breathing stayed for a long time, then slowly faded away. When morning finally came, I felt empty, like all the fear had drained me dry. I knew I had to leave. I packed fast, not caring about being neat. When I opened the door, I froze. There were footprints in the dirt, right in front of the cabin. Bare footprints, large, deep. They faced the door. I did not waste time. I loaded my car and started down the road. About halfway back, I noticed something in my mirror. At first, I thought it was just a shadow between the trees. Then it moved. A figure stepped closer to the road, just enough for me to see the shape of a person. Dirty clothes, thin arms, standing completely still, watching. I did not slow down. I did not look back again. When I reached the main road, my phone got signal. I drove straight to the nearest town and reported everything. The police listened, but I could tell they had heard stories like this before. They told me the area had a history of people living off the grid, sometimes unstable, sometimes dangerous. They said they would check it out. Weeks later, I got a call. They found someone living in a hidden shelter deep in the woods. The trash pile I saw was part of it. The scratches on the cabin were from tools. The breathing was real. The person had been watching renters for years, waiting, learning their habits. No one had gone missing, but some had left early, shaken and silent. I still think about that cabin, about how close I came to staying longer, about how quiet fear can be when it is patient. I no longer look for places that promise total isolation. I learned that quiet does not always mean safe, and sometimes the scariest things do not need to chase you. Sometimes they just wait. I rented the cabin because it was cheap and far from everything. That was the main reason. I wanted silence, real silence, not the kind you get in town where engines and distant horns still sneak in. The listing showed a small wooden place deep in the woods, one room, a porch, and a dirt road that looked more like a scar through the trees. It said the nearest neighbor was miles away. That sounded perfect. I arrived just before sunset. The sky was already turning dull orange, and the trees swallowed most of the light. Pine needles covered the ground so thick it felt soft under my boots. The cabin smelled like old wood and dust when I opened the door. Not rotten, just unused. There was a table, a small bed, a couch that sagged in the middle, and a stove that looked older than me. No electricity, just lanterns and candles, exactly as described. I unloaded my food, water, and a duffel bag with clothes and tools. I checked the windows, 4 of them, all small, all with simple latches. The door had a deadbolt that slid into place with a heavy sound. Solid enough. I told myself that out here, animals were the main concern, not people. The first night went fine. I cooked on the stove, ate slowly, and listened to the forest settle down. At night, the woods are never truly quiet. There are small sounds everywhere, but they blend together. Wind through branches, insects, something moving far away. None of it felt wrong. The second day, I walked the area. The dirt road ended a little past the cabin, turning into nothing but trees and brush. Behind the cabin, the woods dipped down into a shallow ravine where water trickled over rocks. I followed it for a while, then came back. I noticed something that afternoon that I brushed off too easily at the time. A footprint near the edge of the road. Not fresh enough to be clear, but deep, like someone had stood there for a moment. I told myself it could be old, maybe from whoever owned the place, or a hiker passing through. That night I slept badly. Not because of noise, but because of how aware I felt. Every time I shifted on the bed, I woke myself up. At some point, I noticed the smell in the cabin had changed. It was still wood, but mixed with something sour, like damp clothes left too long. I checked my bag, my food, the corners of the room. Nothing explained it. I aired the place out and went back to bed. On the third day, I found the first real sign. I stepped outside in the morning and saw that the dirt in front of the porch had been disturbed. Long lines dragged through the soil. Not animal tracks. They were too straight, too deliberate. Something heavy had been pulled across the ground, stopping right near the steps, then turned back toward the trees. I stood there longer than I should have, just staring. The forest looked the same as always. Tall trunks, dark gaps between them, no movement I could see. I walked around the cabin and checked the windows. One of them, the one behind the bed, had a smear on the glass. A dull mark, like a palm had pressed against it. I wiped it with my sleeve. It didn't come off. That was the moment I should have left. Packed up, locked the door, and driven away. Instead, I told myself it was probably from before. Maybe someone had leaned there months ago. Maybe the dirt lines were from dragging firewood. I stayed because leaving felt like admitting I was scared, and I hated that feeling. The day dragged. The woods felt closer somehow, like the trees had leaned in overnight. Every sound pulled my attention. I kept looking toward the tree line without meaning to. Late in the afternoon, I noticed something else. The ravine behind the cabin had new footprints along the mud near the water. Barely visible but fresh. They led upstream, then vanished into rock. I locked the cabin before dark. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I lay on the bed with the lantern turned low, listening. Sometime after midnight, the sounds changed. The normal noise of the forest faded, replaced by something slower, measured. Heavy steps, not rushing, not careless. They circled the cabin once. I tracked them by sound, my body tight, my hands shaking. The steps stopped near the back wall, close to the window behind the bed. I smelled that sour smell again, stronger now. The window latch rattled once. Just a small movement, like someone testing it. I held my breath until my chest burned. Nothing else happened. After a long time, the steps moved away. I waited until the sky started to lighten before I moved at all. In the morning, I found scratches on the wooden siding under the back window. Long, shallow marks like fingernails or a tool dragged without care. The latch itself was bent slightly outward. I packed my bag. Not neatly. I shoved things in, knocking over the chair, spilling water on the floor. I didn't care. I unlocked the door and stepped onto the porch, ready to leave. That was when I saw the trail. It started at the edge of the woods, directly in front of the cabin. A clear path where branches had been broken, leaves crushed flat, dirt pressed down by repeated steps. It led straight to the porch, stopped, then turned and disappeared back into the trees. This wasn't old. This was worn. Someone had walked this path many times. I didn't follow it. I loaded the car and drove down the dirt road as fast as I dared. The trees closed in on both sides, blocking the sky. Halfway down, I saw something hanging from a branch near the road. Piece of fabric. Dark, dirty, tied in a simple knot. It looked like a marker. I didn't stop. When I reached town, I went straight to a gas station and sat in the car for a long time, hands still shaking. I told myself it was over. I had left. Whatever had been out there, it was behind me. 2 days later, I noticed the smell again. Faint, but there. In my apartment, I searched every room, every bag. Nothing was wrong. That night, I found dirt on my floor near the front door. A thin line, like something had been dragged just inside. I checked the lock. It was fine. Over the next week, small things kept happening. Scratches on the outside of my door. Footprints in the dust of the hallway storage room. Always faint, always easy to explain away if I wanted to lie to myself. I stopped sleeping well. Every sound made my heart jump. I finally went to the police. I told them about the cabin, the tracks, the window. They listened, wrote things down, nodded. They said they would look into it. They told me it was probably someone living rough in the woods, maybe watching for empty places. They said it was unlikely anyone followed me. A month passed. Nothing else happened. The smell faded. The marks stopped appearing. I started to relax again. Then a package arrived at my door. No return address. Inside was a small piece of wood. A splintered shard, darkened with age. I recognized it immediately. It was from the cabin's porch. One side had a shallow scratch, the same kind I'd seen under the window. That was when I understood what I had refused to accept before. The cabin wasn't chosen at random. The isolation wasn't the danger by itself. The danger was that someone had been there long before me, watching, learning routines, learning habits. Someone who didn't speak, didn't rush, didn't need to explain anything. I moved after that. New city, new locks, cameras, lights. I don't go anywhere remote anymore. I don't rent places far from people. I don't trust silence the way I used to. What scares me most isn't what happened in the woods. It's how easily it could have ended differently. If I had stayed one more night, if I had followed that trail, if the latch had been weaker, somewhere out there that cabin is still standing, and someone still knows how to wait. I rented the cabin because I wanted quiet. That was the whole reason. I was tired of the noise from the city, tired of screens, tired of always feeling watched even when no one was looking. The listing was simple. A small wooden cabin deep in the woods, no neighbors close by, limited phone signal, basic power, a wood stove, a well pump, and a dirt road that only saw traffic once or twice a week. Sounded perfect. I packed food for 2 weeks, filled my truck with gas, and drove for hours until paved roads turned into gravel and gravel turned into packed dirt with deep tire marks and puddles frozen solid. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by tall trees that blocked most of the sky. Pine needles covered the ground like a thick carpet. The air smelled damp and old, like soil that never fully dries. The building itself was smaller than the photos showed. One room downstairs, a small loft above, a narrow staircase with no railing, and a porch that sagged slightly in the middle. The door stuck when I opened it, like the wood had swollen over time. Inside, the air was cold and stale. Dust floated in the light coming through the single window. I unpacked slowly, taking my time, enjoying the silence. No cars, no distant hum, just wind through the trees and the occasional creak of wood. I checked the locks on the door and window. They were old but solid. The first night was quiet. I slept on the lower bed with my jacket still on because the cold crept in from the floor. I woke up a few times from the sound of branches scraping the roof, but nothing felt wrong. The second day, I explored the area around the cabin. There were old trails that looked like they had been used years ago and then forgotten. Fallen trees blocked parts of them. I found a small shed behind the cabin that wasn't mentioned in the listing. Inside were rusted tools, an empty gas can, and a shovel with a cracked handle. The ground around the shed was packed hard, like it had been walked on a lot at some point, but now there were no fresh tracks except mine. That night, I noticed something small but strange. When I locked the door before bed, the latch felt looser than it had the night before. I told myself it was just old hardware. Old cabins settle and shift. I went to sleep anyway. Over the next few days, little things started to feel off. Nothing big. Nothing I could point to and say this is wrong. The wood stove damper was open one morning when I was sure I had closed it. A chair that I used as a nightstand seemed slightly farther from the bed. The well pump handle was damp even though I hadn't used it since the evening before. Each time I explained it away. I was tired. I was alone. My sense of space was off. On the 5th night, I woke up to the smell of dirt and metal. Not smoke. Something colder. I sat up in bed and listened. The cabin was quiet, but the quiet felt heavy, like pressure in my ears. I noticed the ladder to the loft had been moved. I never used the loft. I had no reason to move it. I stayed in bed for a long time, staring at the dark shape of the ceiling, telling myself that with contracts at night, that gravity does things you don't notice. The next morning, I found footprints near the porch. Not animal tracks, boots, deep heel marks in the soft ground where the frost had melted. They circled the cabin once and then disappeared into the trees. My stomach dropped in a slow, heavy way. I stood there longer than I should have, hoping I would notice something that made it make sense. A delivery, a hiker, anyone. But the road was empty. No tire tracks, no sounds. I decided to leave the next day. Just one more night, I told myself. I didn't want to drive back in the dark. I spent that day packing most of my things. I kept the truck keys in my pocket. I locked the door even when I stepped outside. The woods felt different now, too quiet. Even the birds seemed gone. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in bed fully dressed, staring at the door. Around sometime after midnight, I heard it. Slow movement outside. Not footsteps exactly, more like weight shifting. A pause, then another. The porch creaked once, very softly. I held my breath without meaning to. I waited for the door to shake, for the handle to move, but nothing happened. After a long time, the sounds faded back into the trees. I didn't move until morning. When the light finally came through the window, I got up and checked the door. The lock was still in place, but the porch had fresh marks, scratches in the wood, like something heavy had been dragged or leaned against it. Near the edge of the clearing, I saw the boot prints again. More of them this time. I loaded the truck as fast as I could. My hands shook so badly I dropped my keys twice. When I turned the ignition, the engine didn't start. The battery was dead. I stood there staring at the dashboard, my breath coming out in short bursts. I had turned everything off. I knew I had. I ran back inside and grabbed my phone. No signal. I tried anyway. Nothing. I checked the hood. The battery cables were loose. Not corroded. Not broken. Just loosened, like someone had taken the time to twist them by hand. That was the moment when denial finally broke. Someone had been here. Someone knew I was alone. I went back into the cabin and locked the door. I moved the table against it, then the bed. I stayed away from the windows. Hours passed. The daylight shifted. As evening came, the fear changed. It stopped being sharp and became heavy and dull, like exhaustion mixed with panic. Near sunset, I heard movement again, this time closer. I saw a shadow pass in front of the window, blocking the light for just a second. Then another. I stayed still, barely breathing. I could hear digging, the sound of metal hitting soil, slow and steady. It went on for a long time. When it stopped, everything went silent again. I waited until my legs ached from holding still. Then I crept to the window and looked out. Near the shed, there was a patch of ground that had been disturbed. Fresh dirt piled to one side. The shovel from the shed leaned against a tree. That night was the longest of my life. I didn't sleep at all. I kept expecting the door to break, expecting the window to shatter. But nothing happened. Just waiting. Just knowing someone was out there and choosing not to rush. The first light, I made a decision. I grabbed the gas can from the shed, poured what little fuel was left into the truck, tightened the battery cables with my bare hands until my fingers hurt, and tried the ignition again. The engine coughed, then started. I didn't waste a second. I drove straight down the dirt road, hitting potholes hard enough to make my teeth rattle. I didn't stop until I reached pavement and saw other cars. I went straight to the nearest town and reported everything. They searched the area later that day. They found the hole near the shed. Inside it were food wrappers, empty water bottles, and a thin blanket. Someone had been living there, close enough to watch the cabin, close enough to wait. They never found the person. I didn't go back to the city right away. I stayed in a motel with the lights on and the door locked. Even now, I still think about how long I had been watched before I noticed anything at all. I think about how easy it was for someone to move around me without being seen. The cabin was quiet, just like I wanted. But quiet doesn't mean empty. I rented the cabin because I wanted to be alone. That is the honest truth. I told myself I needed quiet, space, fresh air, and a break from screens and noise. I found the listing late one night and booked it without thinking too much. The photos showed a small wooden cabin deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. No neighbors, no road noise, no cell service mentioned. That should have been a warning, but at the time it sounded perfect. The drive there took longer than expected. The paved road slowly turned into gravel, then dirt, then something closer to a trail. Trees closed in on both sides, tall and thick, blocking out the sky. My GPS lost signal about 20 minutes before I arrived. I kept driving anyway, trusting the printed directions I had written down. Every few miles there was a wooden post with a faded arrow nailed to it. No words, just arrows pointing deeper into the woods. By the time I reached the cabin, it was late afternoon. The sun was low, and the light was already turning yellow and weak. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by trees on all sides. It was smaller than I expected. One floor, a porch, a metal roof, and a single chimney. No other buildings in sight. No cars. No tracks in the dirt that looked recent. The silence hit me as soon as I turned off the engine. It was heavy, like pressure in my ears. No birds, no insects, just wind moving through the trees, slow and uneven. I stood there for a moment with the car door open, listening, feeling stupid for feeling nervous. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood, dust, and something faintly sour. The furniture was basic and worn. A couch, a small table, 2 chairs, a bed in the corner, and a kitchenette that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. There was a wood stove near the center of the room and a stack of chopped logs by the wall. A single window faced the woods behind the cabin. Another faced the front clearing. I walked through every inch of the place, checking corners, closets, under the bed. I don't know why I did that. Habit, maybe, or instinct. Everything looked empty. No signs of anyone else being there recently. No food in the cabinets. No trash. Just dust and old spiderwebs. As evening settled in, the woods grew darker faster than I expected. The trees blocked most of the remaining light. I turned on the cabin lights, which flickered before staying on. The hum of the generator outside was the only sound breaking the silence. I made myself some canned food, ate it standing up, and tried to relax. That was when I noticed the smell again. Stronger this time. Not rot exactly, but something close, like damp metal and earth mixed together. I assumed it was the old wood stove or maybe animals living under the cabin. Night came fully, and the woods disappeared into a solid black wall beyond the windows. I locked the door without thinking about it. There was no reason not to. The lock was old but solid. I pulled the curtains closed and sat on the couch with a book I never ended up reading. Around midnight, I heard the first sound that didn't belong. It was a soft crunch, like someone stepping on dry leaves. Slow, careful, came from somewhere outside, near the back of the cabin. I froze, listening. The sound stopped. I waited for wind, for branches, for anything to explain it. Nothing came. Then it happened again. 2 steps this time. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. My heart started to pound, loud enough that I worried it might drown out other sounds. I stayed still, barely breathing. I told myself it was an animal. A deer. A raccoon. Anything. But animals move differently. They don't stop like that. They don't sound cautious. The footsteps moved closer to the cabin, circling it slowly. I could hear them on the dirt, then on the porch boards. The wood creaked under weight. Human weight. I was sure of it. I stood up and quietly walked to the window, just enough to peek through a small gap in the curtain. I saw nothing, just darkness and the faint reflection of my own face, pale and tense. There was a soft scraping sound near the back wall, like fingers dragging lightly across wood. Then another, closer to the window. I stepped back, my skin crawling. Every instinct told me not to make noise. Minutes passed, or maybe seconds. Time felt wrong. The sounds stopped again. The silence returned, heavier than before. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch with a kitchen knife in my hand, staring at the door, listening to every tiny sound the cabin made as it cooled and settled. Nothing else happened. When morning finally came, it felt unreal, like I had survived something by accident. In daylight, everything looked normal again, peaceful even. Birds were back. The smell seemed weaker. I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. Almost. I stepped outside to get fresh air and noticed something in the dirt near the back of the cabin. Footprints. Not animal tracks. Boot prints. Several of them. Some overlapping. Some older, some newer. All facing the cabin. They weren't mine. I packed my things immediately. I didn't care about staying longer. I just wanted to leave. As I carried my bag to the car, I noticed something else. scratches on the wood near the back window. Long, thin marks like someone had dragged something hard along the wall. Before getting in the car, I checked under the cabin. I don't know why. Curiosity, maybe, or fear pushing me to understand. Underneath, I found a shallow dugout space. Just enough room for someone to crawl into. There were cigarette butts, food wrappers, and a stained blanket stuffed into the dirt. Someone had been living there, watching. The smell made sense now. I got in the car and drove away as fast as the road allowed. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station hours later. I told the owner about the cabin, about the footprints, about what I found. He went quiet and told me that cabin had been rented out on and off for years, but people never stayed long. Some left early. Some never came back to complain. They just disappeared from the booking site. I didn't report it. I don't know why. Maybe fear. Maybe relief at being alive. Weeks later, I still wake up at night thinking I hear footsteps outside my window. I still smell that damp, metallic scent sometimes, even in my own home. I know now that the scariest thing out there wasn't the woods or the isolation. It was the fact that I was never alone in that cabin. Not for a single moment. And the person watching me knew the woods far better than I ever could. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months, a chance to escape the constant noise of the city and spend a few days alone in the woods. I found the cabin online, tucked deep into the forest, miles away from the nearest town. The listing made it sound perfect. Rustic, quiet, and isolated. At the time, I didn't think about what isolated really meant. The drive there was long. The road narrowed as I left the main highway, turning into a gravel track that bounced under my tires. The forest pressed in from both sides, tall pines and oaks blocking most of the fading sunlight. By the time I finally saw the cabin, the sky was already a deep orange. The cabin itself was smaller than it looked online, with weathered wood and a tin roof that reflected the last rays of sun. I parked beside it and took a long breath, letting the silence settle around me. There were no neighbors, no lights in the distance, just the smell of wet earth and pine. The first night was fine. I unpacked, stacked firewood, and made a small fire in the old stone fireplace. The crackle of burning logs was comforting, and I sat in the cabin's only chair, drinking tea from a thermos, listening to the wind through the trees. I had brought books, a notebook, and some groceries. For a while, it felt like the peace I had been craving. It started the next morning. I woke early, sunlight streaming through the gaps in the window shutters. As I stepped outside to gather some firewood, I noticed tire tracks in the mud. They were fresh, recent, and led off the gravel road into the deeper woods. First, I tried to brush it off. Maybe another hiker had passed by. But the tracks seemed odd. They weren't from a car like mine, smaller, like a four-wheeler or an old pickup. I didn't see anyone that day, and the feeling of unease faded by nightfall. I stayed up a little later than usual, stacking more firewood near the porch. That's when I heard it. The first sound that made my stomach tighten. A faint crunching, like footsteps in the gravel, coming from just beyond the tree line. I froze, straining my ears, and it stopped. I waited, heart hammering, telling myself it was probably a deer or some other animal. By the third day, the cabin's isolation was starting to feel heavier. I went for a hike, following a narrow trail that the map showed winding along a creek. The forest was dense, and every sound seemed amplified. A snapping branch, birds calling, the rush of water over rocks. When I returned, I noticed something disturbing. The front door, which I had locked the night before, was slightly ajar. I hadn't forgotten to lock it. I always double-checked. My pulse quickened, and I stepped inside carefully. Nothing seemed missing, nothing disturbed, but the sense of being watched had started to gnaw at me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin floorboards made me jump. I kept the fire going and checked the doors and windows repeatedly. Around midnight, the sound returned. Faint footsteps outside, circling the cabin. I held my breath, barely moving, until they stopped. I stared at the door, imagining someone waiting just beyond it. My rational mind insisted it was an animal, but a deep part of me knew it wasn't. By the fourth day, the fear had escalated. I decided to leave. I packed what I could, checking the car twice to make sure it would start. But as I stepped onto the porch, I froze. The tire tracks had returned, closer this time, pressed deep into the mud. They went right past the cabin and disappeared into the woods on both sides, like whoever or whatever had made them was moving in circles around me. I didn't know if they were watching, waiting, or just wandering. The thought that someone might have been nearby for days, quietly observing, made me sick with dread. I started the car, letting it warm up while I checked the perimeter. That's when I saw it. A figure in the distance, barely visible through the trees. It was tall, motionless, just standing and watching the cabin. I could barely breathe. I debated whether to drive off slowly or just sit there, hoping they would leave. Then the figure moved slightly, disappearing behind a tree. That was enough. I slammed the car into gear and drove down the gravel track without looking back, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. The drive back to the main road was tense. Every shadow in the trees, every branch scraping against the car felt like it was reaching for me. I forced myself not to stop, not to look for the figure. When I finally reached the highway, lights of other cars and the faint glow of towns on the horizon were almost blinding in their normalcy. It took me a long time before I felt safe, but even then, the image of that figure lingered in my mind. I called the local authorities as soon as I could, reporting what I had seen. They said the area was known for break-ins and that squatters sometimes hid in the woods near isolated cabins. Apparently, the cabin I had rented had been broken into in the past, but the owner hadn't updated the listing. That explained the tire tracks, the figure, the feeling of being watched. I realized that I had been incredibly lucky just a day later. I might have encountered someone much more dangerous. A week later, I returned to check on the cabin, this time with the local sheriff. The place looked the same, quiet and abandoned, but a careful inspection revealed signs of recent habitation. A small fire pit outside, scraps of food, and a makeshift tent hidden behind some trees. Whoever had been there was gone, but they had clearly been living in the woods undetected. The sheriff advised me to never go back alone, and I made the decision to sell my reservation immediately, cutting my trip short permanently. Even now, months later, the memory of those days haunts me. The quiet that had once promised peace became the most terrifying part of the woods. The wind through the trees, the creaking floorboards, the shadowy figure, everything that should have been comforting turned into something threatening. I learned that isolation is a double-edged sword. It offers peace, but also vulnerability. And sometimes, the scariest thing isn't a ghost or a monster, it's another person. Hidden in the dark, watching, waiting, and knowing that you are completely alone. The experience changed how I approach solitude. I no longer romanticize isolation. I plan for it, I check my surroundings, I make sure someone knows where I am. And though I still love the woods, I only go with friends or guides now. That cabin in the forest, so still and quiet, is a reminder of how fragile safety can be, and how quickly normal life can turn into a nightmare. I rented the cabin because I wanted to be alone. That was the honest reason, even if I didn't like saying it out loud. I was tired of people, tired of noise, tired of screens, tired of feeling watched even when I was sitting in my own room. The cabin was deep in the woods, far enough that my phone barely worked, far enough that the road turned into dirt for the last few miles. It was late fall, the kind of cold that gets into your bones but still lets you walk without snow up to your knees. I told myself it would be quiet and simple. I told myself nothing bad ever really happens in places like that. The cabin looked old but solid. Thick logs, darkened with age, a metal roof with rust around the edges. The porch boards creaked under my boots. There were no other cabins in sight, no lights in the distance, just trees. Tall, thin trees packed close together, their bare branches scratching the sky. The silence felt heavy, like the woods were holding their breath. Inside, it smelled like old wood and dust. The furniture was basic. A table, 2 chairs, a couch, a small bed pushed against the wall. There was a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a bathroom that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. Everything worked, though. The water ran cold and clear. The lights came on. The door locked. That first night went fine. I cooked canned food, built a fire, and sat there listening to the crackle of wood and the wind outside. The quiet was deep. No cars, no voices, no distant hum of a city. Just wind and the occasional snap of a branch. I slept heavy. The second day, I noticed the first thing that didn't feel right. When I stepped outside in the morning, there were footprints near the edge of the clearing. Not animal tracks, human boot prints. They were half filled with leaves, which meant they weren't brand new, but they weren't old either. I told myself they could be from the owner checking the place, or maybe hikers passing through. The woods are full of paths you don't see on maps. I didn't like it, but I didn't panic. I walked around the cabin, looking closer. The footprints didn't come all the way up to the porch. They circled the cabin once and then headed back into the trees. I stood there longer than I meant to, staring into the woods, trying to spot movement. Nothing moved. The trees just stood there, thin and crowded, blocking the view after a few feet. That night, the wind picked up. The cabin made sounds I hadn't heard before. Soft pops from the logs as they cooled. A low whistle through a gap somewhere in the walls. I lay in bed listening, my eyes open, counting the seconds between gusts. At some point, I heard a sound that didn't fit. A dull thud, like something heavy hitting wood, came from outside, near the back of the cabin. I didn't get up right away. I lay still, listening. The sound didn't repeat. The wind kept blowing. I told myself it was a branch falling, maybe hitting the wall. Trees shed dead limbs all the time. Still, I didn't sleep much after that. The third day, I found the mark. On the back wall of the cabin, low to the ground, there was a dark scuff on the logs. Fresh wood showed through, scraped raw. It looked like something hard had been dragged or pressed against it. I ran my fingers over it and felt the roughness. Whatever caused it wasn't small. That was the point where my thoughts started to shift. I stopped thinking about peaceful solitude and started thinking about distance. How far the cabin really was from anyone else. How long it would take for help to arrive if I needed it. My phone showed 1 week bar if I stood on the porch and held it just right. I decided to leave the next morning. I told myself I was being smart, not scared. Still, I double-checked the locks that night. I added a chair under the door handle, even though I knew how useless that would be if someone really wanted to get in. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a sound that pulled me straight out of sleep. Slow, steady pressure against the cabin. Not a bang, not scratching, just weight, like someone leaning against the wall. I held my breath without meaning to. My heart hammered so hard it felt like it might give me away. The pressure shifted. It moved along the wall, inch by inch, stopping and starting. I could hear faint noises now. Not words, just breathing. Heavy, controlled breathing. Too close. I stayed frozen in bed, staring at the dark ceiling. Every part of me wanted to run, but I knew any sudden noise could make things worse. Minutes passed like hours. The pressure eventually eased, and the breathing faded. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't hear the door. Just silence. I didn't sleep after that. When the sky finally started to lighten, I got up and packed everything as fast as I could. My hands shook the whole time. I opened the door slowly and stepped onto the porch. The ground was soft from the night frost melting. Fresh boot prints led right up to the back wall of the cabin. Bigger than mine. Deeper. They circled the building again, closer this time. One set stopped right outside the small bathroom window. That window was frosted, but thin. Someone could have stood there and watched the shadow of me moving inside. I loaded my car and left. The drive out felt longer than the drive in. Every curve in the road made me tense, expecting to see someone standing there. I didn't stop until I reached pavement and saw other cars. I told myself it was over. I told myself I was safe. A week later, I got an email from the rental owner. It was short and polite. They thanked me for staying and asked if everything was okay. They mentioned they'd gone out to the cabin after I left because a neighbor had reported damage. The damage was to the back wall. Deep marks like repeated impacts, too high to be from falling branches. too deliberate. The owner said they had also found a makeshift shelter about 50 yards into the woods. Plastic sheets, food wrappers, empty bottles. Someone had been living there for a while. The police were notified. They searched the area but didn't find anyone. The shelter was abandoned. The tracks led deeper into the forest and disappeared. The owner apologized again and refunded my stay. They said they were installing cameras and stronger locks. I read that email more than once. I kept thinking about how long that person had been there, how many nights they might have watched the cabin before I arrived, how close they had been while I slept. What scares me most is how quiet it all was. No shouting, no breaking in, just patience, just waiting. Whoever it was didn't rush. They didn't need to. I don't go places like that anymore. I don't chase silence. I learned that deep quiet doesn't mean empty. Sometimes it just means there's nothing to drown out the sound of someone else breathing in the dark. Close enough to touch the wall you're leaning against. Close enough to know exactly where you are. I went to the cabin because I wanted silence. That was the honest reason. I was tired of phones, tired of people, tired of noise that never stopped. The cabin was cheap, far from the road, and surrounded by thick woods that looked untouched on the map. It was late October when I arrived, the kind of cold that does not hurt yet but makes your breath show. The trees were tall and bare, their branches thin and sharp, and the ground was covered with wet leaves that stuck to my boots. The cabin sat alone in a small clearing, old but solid, with dark wood walls and a metal roof that had rust along the edges. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, empty quiet. No birds, no wind moving the trees, nothing. Even my footsteps sounded wrong, like the forest was swallowing the noise instead of letting it travel. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The smell hit me right away. Old wood, dust, and something sour, like damp clothes left too long in a closed space. The inside was simple. One main room, a small kitchen area, a table, 2 chairs, and a couch that looked like it had been there for decades. There was a small bedroom in the back and a bathroom with a weak-looking shower. I set my bag down and walked around, checking corners, opening cabinets, looking under furniture. I did not expect to find anything, but being alone out there made me careful. Everything looked normal. The windows were small and thick, and they let in very little light. Even during the day, the cabin felt dim. I told myself it was just because of the trees. By late afternoon, the sky had turned gray, and the temperature dropped fast. I started a fire in the old stone fireplace. The sound of wood cracking was the first normal sound I had heard since arriving. It helped a little. I cooked a simple meal and ate at the table, listening to the fire and the soft hum of the cabin settling. Every now and then, I thought I heard something outside, but when I focused, there was nothing. I blamed my nerves and the new place. When night came, it came hard. No slow sunset, no warning. One moment it was dim, and the next it was dark. Real dark. I turned on the lights, but they were weak, yellow, and barely pushed back the shadows. The forest outside the windows turned into a solid black wall. I could not see even a single tree shape. It felt like the cabin was floating in nothing. That was when I noticed the first strange thing. There were marks on the inside of the front door. Not scratches from an animal, but deep lines, uneven, like someone had dragged something hard across the wood. They were old, faded, but clear if you looked closely. I had not seen them earlier, or maybe I had not wanted to. I touched them with my fingers and felt the grooves. They were rough and deep enough to catch my nail. I told myself it was from moving furniture or something heavy. Old cabins had history. That was normal. Still, I locked the door and checked the windows again. I went to bed early because there was nothing else to do. The bedroom was colder than the main room, and the bed creaked when I lay down. I stared at the ceiling, listening. The fire had burned down, and the cabin made small noises as the temperature dropped. Wood popping, metal ticking. Normal sounds, I told myself. Then I heard footsteps. They were not close. They were outside somewhere in the trees. Slow, steady, not rushed. Leaves crunching, stopping, then starting again. I held my breath and listened. The steps moved around the cabin, not circling but drifting, like whoever was out there was not in a hurry. I stayed still, hoping the sound would fade. It did after a while, leaving behind that heavy silence again. I barely slept that night. In the morning, I felt stupid for being scared. Daylight made everything look less threatening. The forest was still quiet, but I could hear wind now and far-off birds. I stepped outside and walked around the cabin. That was when I saw the footprints. They were pressed deep into the wet ground near the back of the cabin. Boot prints. Big ones. Not mine. They came from the tree line, stopped near the back wall, and then went back the same way. I followed them with my eyes until they disappeared into the leaves. My chest felt tight. I told myself someone might have passed by, maybe another hiker or hunter, but there were no trails nearby, no roads, and the prints were fresh. From the night before, I went back inside and locked the door again. The rest of the day felt wrong. Every small sound made me jump. The cabin felt smaller, like the walls had moved closer. I tried to distract myself by cleaning, by reading, by cooking, but my mind kept going back to the footprints. I kept checking the windows. Nothing moved outside. That night, the footsteps came back. This time they were closer. I heard them right outside the walls. Slow, heavy. Whoever it was walked around the cabin, stopping near windows, near the door. I could hear breathing once, faint but real. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. I stayed on the floor, away from the windows, holding a flashlight and a small knife I had brought for camping. The footsteps stopped at the front door. There was no knock, no handle turning, just stillness. Minutes passed, maybe more. Then the steps moved away back into the woods. I did not move for a long time after that. When morning came, I knew I could not stay another night. I packed my things fast, not caring about being neat. When I opened the front door, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Fresh marks on the door, new lines deeper than the old ones. Someone had tried to force it open. The lock held, but barely. The wood around it was cracked. I did not waste time. I loaded my car and drove down the narrow dirt road as fast as I could without losing control. I did not stop until I reached the main road and saw other cars. Only then did I feel like I could breathe again. Later, I reported it. I told them about the footprints, the marks, the nights. They said they would check it out. I never heard back. A few weeks later, out of curiosity and regret, I looked up the cabin listing again. It was gone. The page did not exist anymore. No explanation. I still think about that place. Not because of something unreal or imagined, but because of how real it was. Someone was out there. Someone knew that cabin was empty except for me. Someone took their time. And the worst part is knowing that if the door had been weaker, or if I had stayed one more night, the ending would have been very different. I do not go looking for silence anymore. I went to the cabin because I wanted quiet. That was the honest reason. I was tired of noise, tired of screens, tired of waking up already stressed. The cabin sat deep in the woods, far from the nearest town. A place I had found online that looked plain and forgotten. No charm, no fake cozy look. Just a small wooden building surrounded by trees. That was what I wanted. Somewhere that did not try to impress me. The drive there took most of the day. The road slowly broke down from smooth pavement into cracked asphalt, then into gravel, then into dirt that kicked up dust behind my car. Trees closed in tighter the farther I went. Tall pines and thick brush blocked the sky until the light turned dull and green. I lost phone signal hours before I arrived. That did not worry me at first. I expected it. The cabin appeared suddenly at the end of a narrow path, like it had been dropped there and forgotten. It was smaller than the pictures. One floor, gray wood, a slanted roof with dark stains from old rain. The windows were narrow and dirty. There was no fence, no nearby buildings, no signs of life. Just trees, quiet, and the cabin. When I stepped out of the car, the silence felt heavy. Not peaceful, heavy. No birds, no wind. Even my footsteps sounded wrong, too loud against the dirt. I unlocked the cabin door with the key I had been mailed. The lock stuck for a second before turning. That small resistance made my stomach tighten, though I told myself it meant nothing. Inside, the air smelled old and damp, like wood that had been wet too many times and never dried right. The place was simple. One small table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed, a sink with a hand pump, and a small stove. No electricity. A lantern sat on the table. Dust coated everything. I wiped the table with my sleeve and left a clean streak through the gray. I spent the first hour unpacking and settling in. I brought canned food, water, a sleeping bag, and extra batteries for the lantern. I checked the windows, all of them closed. The door locked fine from the inside. Nothing looked broken. Nothing looked wrong. I kept telling myself that. By late afternoon, the light outside started to fade. The trees blocked the sun early, and shadows stretched long across the ground. I cooked a simple meal on the stove and ate alone at the table. The quiet pressed in on me again. Every small sound stood out. The scrape of the spoon, the creak of the floor when I shifted my weight, my own breathing. That was when I heard something outside. First, it was faint, a soft sound, like leaves being brushed aside. I froze and listened. It stopped. I waited. Nothing. I told myself it was an animal. Deer maybe, or a raccoon. This was the woods. Sounds happened. I cleaned up and tried to relax. I read for a while by lantern light, but my focus kept slipping. Every few minutes, I paused to listen. The forest stayed quiet, too quiet. No insects, no night sounds starting up like they should have. When it got fully dark, I locked the door and checked the windows again. I pulled the curtains closed. The cabin felt smaller at night. The walls seemed closer, the ceiling lower. I lay down on the bed and turned off the lantern, hoping sleep would come fast. It did not. I lay there staring into the dark, counting my breaths, listening. Hours passed. Then I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, careful. Not heavy like a large animal, not rushed like something scared. Measured. One step, then another, circling the cabin. My heart started to pound. I stayed still, barely breathing. The steps moved along the wall, stopping near a window. I heard a soft scrape, like fingers brushing glass or wood. Then silence. I waited for something else to happen. It did not. After a long time, the steps moved away. I did not sleep at all that night. Morning light felt like a relief. I convinced myself the fear was just my mind reacting to isolation. I stepped outside to look around. The ground around the cabin was soft dirt and pine needles. I saw tracks near one window, not animal tracks, boot prints, old worn boots with uneven soles. They circled the cabin once. I stood there staring at them, trying to think of a reasonable explanation. Maybe the owner had been there recently. Maybe a hiker passed through. But the prints were fresh. They had been made during the night. During the hours I was awake and listening. I considered leaving right then, packing up and driving away. But pride got in the way. So did stubbornness. I did not want to believe I was that scared. I told myself it was probably someone checking the place, someone harmless. I decided to stay one more night. That decision was a mistake. The second day dragged on. The forest stayed quiet. No signs of animals. No sounds of people. The air felt thick, like a storm was coming but never arrived. I kept checking the tree line without meaning to. Every shadow looked deeper than it should have. As the sun went down again, the fear returned stronger. I locked the door early. I moved the table slightly closer to it, not enough to block it, just enough to make noise if it moved. I kept the lantern on. The footsteps came earlier this time. Not slow, faster, more confident. They stopped right outside the door. I could hear breathing, slow and steady. Someone was standing there. I sat frozen on the bed, staring at the door. The handle did not move. The lock stayed still. Minutes passed. Then something heavy leaned against the door, testing it. Not hard enough to break it, just pressure, like they wanted to know how strong it was. Then they moved to a window. The curtain shifted slightly, pushed from the outside. A shape blocked the faint light. Ahead, close to the glass. I could not see details, only a dark outline. I felt sick. I did not move. I did not make a sound. The shape stayed there for a long time. Then it pulled away. The rest of the night was a blur of fear. More footsteps, scraping sounds. Once I heard something being dragged through the dirt. I sat awake until dawn, clutching the lantern like it could protect me. When morning came, I packed everything as fast as I could. My hands shook so badly I dropped things. Outside, I saw deep marks in the dirt near the door, scratches in the wood. Someone had tried to pry a window open, harder than before. I did not look around anymore. I did not try to understand. I got in my car and drove. The road felt endless. Every curve made me tense, expecting to see someone standing there. I did not stop until I reached a town with people and noise and light. Later, I reported what happened. I told the owner. I told local authorities. They said the area had a history of squatters and people living off the grid, some unstable, some violent. The cabin was taken down a few months later, removed completely. What stayed with me was not just the fear. It was the patience of it. The way whoever it was did not rush, did not panic, just watched, tested, waited. I wanted silence when I went into those woods. I got it, too much of it. And now I understand something simple and ugly. Silence is not empty. Sometimes it is just someone holding their breath nearby, waiting for you to make a mistake.